Hey guys, welcome back to another great game of CEDH. I've since recovered from Con Flu, so thanks for all the well wishes that you guys have been sending me. Today I actually get to feature a really cool game I played with some other content creators. First up, as a returning guest to the channel, is VeilofDeathMTG. As described as the most metal CEDH channel on YouTube, he does great gameplays and a lot of other stuff, so definitely check him out. With our other guest being Islane from The Possibility Storm. He does a lot of great CEDH content, but he also has been playing a lot of CPEDH, or Competitive Pauper EDH, and it's a really cool format you guys should definitely check out. It was great getting games in with the both of you, and hopefully we'll get even more in the future.
Also, have you heard the news? Your favorite CEDH YouTube channel has released some cool merch. And if you're interested in picking up some sweet new apparel, come check us out. Also, if you like what you see, consider joining our Patreon, as with your help, we can keep producing the videos you enjoy. And if you want to play with us, hop on our Discord. We have an ever-growing community that loves to talk MTG, or whatever else strikes our fancy. And we would love to meet new people. Alright, block there, kill that. Oh, that is trample. Guess I'm just dead on board. Starting us off is Death with Raffine, Scheming Seer. This is an Esper control deck with the Reanimator subtheme, using the awesome Connive ability to discard Reanimator targets, while also using the counters to beef up your creatures like Esper Sentinel. With Raffine, you can really churn through your deck while pressuring your opponent's life total. Next up is Hidden Planet X on Marneus Calgar. This is a mid-range deck that looks to combo out quickly if it can, or prolong the game, or gain value while using its commander's draw and activated abilities. It also has the power to beat down pretty heavily on our opponents if need be. The deck runs a lot of Esper good stuff, but has a lot of fun synergies with its commander. In the third spot is Gatorbait TV with Rog-Tevesh. This is a Rakdos Turbo Nas strategy. It's a proactive Rakdos Storm deck that uses Rog to enable a variety of additional fast mana and leverages Tevesh as a card advantage engine. And bringing up the rear is Islane, piloting Tivit, Seller of Secrets. This is an Esper deck that carries a high density of win cons. Plus, having a 1-card combo in Time Thief makes Tivit an ever-present threat, while functioning as a hard-to-interact with value engine in the meantime. But without further ado, let's get on to the gameplay. Death starts off the game with a Polluted Delta, cracking it for a scrub land, but shortcutting as he casts a Sarah's Ascendant. Hidden as a Sea of Clouds and casts a turn 1 Mystic Remora, following it up with a Mox Diamond, discarding an Otawaro. He doesn't want to feed another fish in case one comes out, and ends his turn with a Jeweled Lotus. Gator announces he'll be a responsible player as he plays a Sulphurous Springs and his commander Rograk. Islane also agrees not to feed the fish and just has a scrub land. Death also plays a Sea of Clouds and heads to combat. He sends his Ascendant at Hidden for 6. Hidden untaps and pays for his Remora. He plays out a Flooded Strand, cracking his fetch, which does actually prompt a response from Death. Although Hidden breathes a sigh of relief when it's just an Archivist of Ogma. Hidden grabs out an Underground Sea, with Death getting his draw. Hidden then taps out for his commander Marneus and passes after that. Gator plays a Phyrexian Tower and for 2 casts a Goblin Engineer. He bins a Bolas Citadel and gives a draw to Death. I say the dumb Archivist is drawing you more cards than my fish.
It is a guarantee, unfortunately.
Well, your fish is stopping me from playing my hand. So like,
Same.
You should have let it die. You're just
yeah, you should have let it die, man.
Islane then switches out his land for a Flooded Strand and cracks it to grab out a Tundra. Death gets a draw, and Islane then casts a Grand Abolisher.
I mean, it's just because it's the only thing I can fucking cast.
I mean, I would still really interact with that for the record, but if I could.
This is what we were just talking about, wasn't it? He's priority bullying already.
I don't have anything to do to it, considering I haven't played anything.
I know.
Is that everything?
I got more response.
That's all I got. So if it's good, you're good to go.
Bro, I could have cast my Force of Will, but now I can't because it resolved.
Death plays an Underground Sea and for 3 casts his commander Raffine. Death then heads to combat and sends his Ascendant at Gator, with the Archivist heading at Islane. This triggers Raffine to have Death connive away a Mox Opal and a Deep Analysis, to put 2 counters on the Archivist, ending his turn discarding a Mystical Tutor due to hand size. Hidden keeps paying for his fish.
Fish has drawn 0 cards.
I know.
You're paying for the fish?
Yeah. Well, I clearly don't have any free counterspells, or I would have countered either the Raffine or Grand Abolisher, so I need to draw some cards. Eventually, someone's gonna break.
Oh, I have to break because we buried ourselves in the Ogma.
Yeah.
So I have to make you draw to handle that now.
Yep.
You don't have to. You can just play a land and pass the turn.
I'm just gonna pass after that, though.
We're on 23 lands. I don't know if that's a play pattern that this deck can accomplish.
Gator doesn't have a land, and for 2 casts a Liquid Metal Torque. He gives a card to Hidden and follows it up with his Sensei's Divining Top. Hidden draws and Gator passes after that. Alright, so at end step, do we think it's an issue for him to have the Abolisher?
He can play land, Oracle, Demonic Consultation, and nobody can stop him.
Yeah, but
He just wins the game.
or is it better? Like, I can't kill Raffine, unfortunately, but is it better for me to, if I had a removal spell, should I be deploying it, or do you think we should be waiting on that?
It's a 50-50 chance. I can tell you this: I cannot do anything if you do anything. So
I personally, myself, like, I would get rid of the Grand Abolisher, but I took 2 turns off to not feed the fish, so I'm so far behind this game. I'm essentially worthless.
I
So
too
if
am
end up
behind.
winning-
I can tell you I'm not going to win on my turn unless I drew the nut. Then maybe.
then not.
Alright, then I don't have
That
any
means
response.
that means half is in his hand, for the record. If he says the nut, that's a singular. That's 1 card. For the
Well, then
record.
I'll risk it then.
Risk it for the biscuit.
Yeah. Islane plays a Morphic Pool as land and casts a Lotus Petal. He gives a card to Hidden and then casts a Soul Ring. Hidden draws again, with Islane tapping out to cast his commander Tivit. He ends up getting 2 treasures and 3 clues, passing after that. Death untaps and plays a Mana Confluence. Combat is then held as he sends the Ascendant at Islane, the Archivist heads at Gator, and Raffine goes at Hidden. Death then gets the Connive and discards a Demonic Tutor, a Luris, and a Mnemonic Betrayal. Both Hidden and Islane have no blocks, while Gator chumps his Goblin Engineer. Then, on his second main, Death casts a Ranger Captain of Eos, who on ETB grabs an Esper Sentinel. Death does cast it, but this prompts a response as Hidden then swords the Grand Abolisher. Hidden untaps and lets the fish go. He plays a Swamp as land for turn, and for 4 casts a Smothering Tithe. He gives a card to Death, but the enchantment resolves, with Hidden being done after that. Gator draws and doesn't pay for the Tithe. Hidden gains a treasure token and a draw off Marneus. A Mox Amber then is cast, and Gator gives a card to Death, which also triggers the Tithe. Death can't pay, and Hidden gets another treasure and a draw. Gator then follows us up with a Dockside Extortionist. Islane is the first to respond as he cracks 2 treasures to crack a clue. This gives Hidden another treasure and a draw, with Hidden being greedy and not cracking any of his treasures. Gator gets 9 treasures and spends 4 of them on a Harmfell, Horn of Bounty. He discards a Skull Clamp to exile a Feed the Swarm and an Abrade. Gator then discards a Rakdos Signet to exile a Badlands and a Cutdown. He plays the Badlands as land, and then for 5 casts his other commander, Tevesh Sat, uptaking the Walker to sacrifice Rog-Tevesh to draw 3. This also gives Hidden 3 treasures and draws 3 off the Tithe.
Oh man, that is insane.
Yep.
I would have killed that thing if I could read. Obviously.
Well, unfortunately, cutting. Well, yeah, I guess feed could kill it.
Yeah, feed. I'd have killed it. I just can't obviously read. So,
You're still sick. We forgive you.
we're bad at this.
You can still
This
do it.
game.
You can sacrifice Dockside and still kill it.
Islane untaps, draws, pays the tithe tax, and has a Scalding Tarn as land. He then cracks the fetch to grab an Underground Sea. This gets Death another card draw from the Archivist, which also gets Hidden a treasure and a draw. Islane then heads to combat and sends Tivit at Death, as commander damage is looking like the only way to take him out at this point. Death does not block, and after voting, Islane gets 2 treasures and 3 clues. Then, on his second main, Islane casts a March of Otherworldly Lights on the Smothering Tithe. He has to crack the last of his treasure to pay for Death's Esper Sentinel, and Hidden responds with a miscast. Hidden doesn't pay for the Esper, with Death drawing and giving the spent treasure right back to Hidden. Death then pays 2 life to Mental Misstep the miscast. But Hidden wants his tithe and cracks 2 treasures to Muddle the Mixture on the March. Death untaps and on his upkeep sacks his Ranger Captain. And while Hidden does have a bunch of cards in hand, none of them stop the Ranger, so he passes priority to Gator, who starts discarding to the Horn. He discards a Crow Mox and exiles a Fire Covenant and a Lightning Bolt. Next, Gator sacks his Dockside for double black, using one of them on a Rain of Filth. Death draws off the Esper, with Hidden getting a treasure and a draw. Gator then discards another card, exiling a land and a Blood Pet. Not seeing anything helpful, Gator then sacrifices 2 lands to help cast an opposition agent. The agent resolves, and with the Ranger Captain sack still on the stack, Hidden fires off a Cyclonic Rift to target the Raffine. Hidden does pay for the ward, but doesn't pay for the Esper Sentinel. Death draws, and responding to Hidden's Tithe trigger, he casts a Flusterstorm, where Storm is 4. Hidden can't pay for it, and the table now lets the Tithe trigger resolve. Hidden thought it was interesting though that Death was fighting over his commander, and with the sack still on the stack, he fires off a Chain of Vapor on the Raffine, still paying the ward. The Raffine is bounced, and this time Death chooses not to sack a land to copy it. The Ranger Captain then resolves, and Death finally moves to his draw step. He doesn't pay for the tithe, and Hidden gains his treasure and draws, with Death on his main phase casting a Mox Diamond. He discards an Ancient Tomb and then plays a Cephalid Coliseum as land.
You're not making my life easy with that.
You've got basically a silence, so.
Yeah, but you forced me to use too many of my resources.
I mean, you don't have to counter anything if we can't cast spells.
Yeah, well, I needed my Raffine to complete my combo. Now I have to do it a different way.
Aw.
Death then casts a Swords on the Oppo and a Culling the Weak, sacrificing his Esper Sentinel for 4 black mana. He then uses one of it on an Imperial Seal, to which Hidden actually has a response as he flashes in an Oppo of his own. And surprisingly, Death doesn't just have a counterspell, as he cracks his Coliseum to have him draw 3 and discard 3. This puts 3 Tithe triggers on the stack and gives Hidden 3 treasures and 3 draws. Death is really scrabbling for an answer, as he uses one of his floating black on a Demonic Consultation, naming Force of Will.
I literally have nothing.
Yeah.
I'm about to join you on that one, because you all are making my life busy. So,
I don't want to hear
Demonic
complaints from the
Consultation.
person that's at 53 life and drawn like 20 extra cards as well.
You will hear a lot of complaints from me.
Death starts exiling, and luckily it's not on the top 6, as he continues to exile cards. Unfortunately, hitting his Labman and Thassa's, exiling a lot of his library as well. He doesn't even end up casting the Force, as with his win cons gone, he's not sure how he gets out of this. The Oppo then resolves, and Hidden gets to tutor out something out of what's left of Death's library, with him ending up grabbing a Mana Crypt, and Death passing after that. Hidden untaps and shocks in a Hollowed Fountain. He then casts his Stolen Mana Crypt, and with no one having really anything left, Hidden is able to go Grand Abolisher, Isochron Scepter, Traumatic Reversal, and a Hullbreaker Horror, which would let him draw his deck and Thassa's for the actual win.
And before I get onto the game review, I want to thank a very special Patreon supporter, Josh Schutt, for his continued support of the channel. Game review. Well, I guess my greed really paid off. I really didn't expect my fish to slow down the table as much as it did. And I was a little worried by not sacrificing all my treasures to give Gatorbait extra treasures himself, but I guess it all paid off. But speaking of greedy plays, I really think Gator should have played it greedy. His deck is all about speed and being proactive, not reactive. So by him playing it safe, he really just put himself in a bad position, where he just got outdrew by every other table on the deck. And by the end, he had no cards in hand and really no game plan. As for Islane, he probably also could have been a little more greedy, at least with the Soul Ring. That really would have helped him speed out his plays a little bit more than waiting as long as he did. And as for Death, I think he played it okay, although I really thought he just had the win in hand, especially since he was discarding all those tutors and whatnot. But that's just how it goes. He did originally say he wasn't planning on going for it as early as he did, but he saw us blow all that interaction and thought it was the best possible opportunity. I guess we just really got lucky that the double oppo really did stop him. But thank you for everyone that watched, and thank you for Islane and Death for coming on the channel. If you guys are interested in finding out more on their content, I'll have their links down below. And remember, never give up, even if you're dead on board. I'll see you guys later.